hospital into the community. One new study reveals that the suicide rate among newly discharged mental patients is more than 200 times higher than for the rest of the population. Our Home Affairs correspondent Robert Parker reports now on how the neglect faced by the mentally ill in the community can all too often have tragic consequences.
Mark Beath developed schizophrenia 5 years ago when he was just 18.
I cannot think of anything he didn't try in the community. It's called community care. Hostels, street, prison, bed and breakfasts, hospital and his own flat.
Just over a year ago, with his condition worsening, his parents managed to get him accepted back at Knapsbury Hospital near St Albans, where he'd been twice before. But last August he was taken to this hostel in North London as part of a plan to begin caring for him again in the community.
He was taken up to a room, put his little things in a locker, went down to the kitchen, said he was hungry, made a sandwich, said he was off to the day centre, given 30p for a cup of tea and left the building. So within about an hour and a half of being left there, he had jumped off car park and was dead.
The car park from which Mark jumped was within a stone's throw of his old flat, and in the heart of the very community in which he was being looked after.
If he'd been allowed to stay in hospital, he'd have been alive today. And community care isn't a substitute for the hospital. Some people need to be hospitalized and they're happier there and they get the care they need and the care they want, and to be getting rid of all these hospitals is absolute madness.
The hospital where Mark was is in the process of closing down. Since the 1960s, more than 2/3 of all hospital beds for mental illness have been closed, and there are now less than 50,000 beds remaining. And since last year, the government has accelerated this process by moving funds to local authorities to care for people discharged from hospitals in the community. But far removed from the cities where many discharged psychiatric patients tend to end up, comes an alarming piece of research about the fate of patients who now find themselves being cared for in the community.
What we see is a very high rate, relatively, of suicides in that first 4-week period after discharge from psychiatric hospital, and an elevated rate...
At Magdalen College, Oxford, Dr. Michael Goldacre examined what happened to every single patient discharged from mental hospitals in his region. The results were astonishing.
What we found was that in the first year after discharge from psychiatric hospital, suicide rates in the psychiatric population were 50 times higher than those in the general local population. And when we looked at suicide rates in the first 4 weeks after discharge, we found that suicide rates were 200 times higher in men than they are in the general population in a comparable time period, and 130 times higher in women than they are in the female population during a comparable time period.
It's estimated that about 40% of homeless people in Britain have mental illness and have been earlier discharged from hospitals, something we found when we filmed these homeless people in Worcester. The National Schizophrenia Fellowship also estimates that there are 1,300 sufferers in prisons. That's because the behaviour caused by their illness often brings them into contact with the police, and because there are no hospital beds for them. A report by the organisation Into Suicide says it all adds up to a devastating indictment of how community care is working.
As we speak, there are thousands of people around the country with schizophrenia, described by the World Health Organisation as the worst illness you can have, on their own, in council flats, in bedsits, in rural areas, out of touch with people, hardly any friends, perhaps they've lost contact with their family, they may be taking a few drugs, they've got little chance of employment, they've got little chance of making something with their lives, and little is being done for those people.
The case of Ben Silcock, who was mauled by a lion after he entered its cage at London Zoo, is, say some, a symptom of the failures of community care. So too is the case of Christopher Clunis, who, while out in the community, killed schoolteacher Jonathan Zito. His widow was highly critical of community care, as indeed are many experts.
It's extremely difficult to get into hospital when you need to be in. When you're discharged, you're not getting the aftercare that you may need. Services are not geared up to providing treatment in the community. There is insufficient accommodation for people to live in when they leave hospital, and very many people come in and either lose accommodation or indeed started out homeless. There simply aren't the services there responding to them when they need them.
But community care can work, and work well. This is Northover Court in Bournemouth, a centre for people with schizophrenia and other mental health problems. It's owned by the Shaftesbury Housing Trust and run by the National Schizophrenia Fellowship.
See you later, Alex.
Yeah, catch you later, Christine.
Yeah.
There are 20 residents divided into 4 groups, each in separate flats.
If you write your name down there and then
yes,
you can do the cross
next,
But each of the 4 flats has a trained key worker and an assistant. Unlike some types of care in the community, there's somebody to keep an eye out for any relapse or serious change of mood, something all too common with schizophrenia. The care is informal and tailored to the varying needs of its residents, who all seem to love the centre. It costs £195 a week per resident for a place. This may not be cheap, but for the time the centre's been running, there has not been a single suicide or suicide attempt. This former student had made several attempts on his life before he finally got a place at the centre.
I could see my friends around me finishing college, going on to university and this sort of thing. And that for me was just like there was this void in my life.
Do you think that's very much less likely to happen here?
I would say so, yes. Because the staff can see it happening and they can nip it in the bud.
I heard that it costs about £70,000 to keep a person in hospital, and it doesn't cost anything like that to be in here. And you do have the care, you know.
But this kind of care in the community is all too rare. Before Mark Beath took his own life last August, he'd experienced, said his family, a totally different kind of care. His desolation perhaps reflected in his drawings and poetry. The coroner at his inquest said he had been cared for well by all local agencies. But many concerned people say much needs to be done to improve care and to help reduce suicides.
The major problem, I think, is a lack of planning jointly by health and social services for the needs of very seriously, chronically mentally ill people. People with recurrent or persistent disorders, which a long time ago would have led to them staying in hospital for most of their lives.
I would like to bring it to your attention that Mark Beath has been sleeping in our garage for the past month.
And for Mark's family, looking over the files of his case, there's only one conclusion about what's happened. A conclusion that perhaps many other similar families will also share.
When will the government start to listen? My son is dead. He's dead. He killed himself. And I am sure that the reasons we've discussed here were actually great contributing factors, that he felt there was no community care, that the hospital was being shut on him. Where was he to go? What was there out there for him?
Robert Parker.